nonprofit TAT Foundation was created in 1973 to bring spiritual seekers and finders together. We publish books, videos, and a free online newsletter. We maintain a website of spiritual resources and hold 4 spiritual retreat weekends each year. Our goal is to offer practical guidance for following a spiritual path and living a spiritual life. For more information, go to tatfoundation.org. That's tatfoundation.org. So we began this weekend exploration with the help of Tess Hughes. A little bit of background: Tess was born into an Irish Catholic family and became a spiritual seeker at a young age. Her book, This Above All, A Journey of Self-Discovery, lays out the path that led Tess to the spiritual realization that ended her search in 2010. Tess writes, "There is really only one story in life, the story of finding happiness, or more accurately, finding what we really are." She says, because becoming what you truly are answers all of your questions.
So, welcome everybody from wherever you are in the world, this extraordinary thing of virtual retreats where somebody could be any place on the globe at the same time it's a new thing, shall we say. So the title of our retreat this weekend is Through the Eyes of a Child. And when I was asked to speak at this and when I heard the title, my first reaction was, well, I'm in a good position for that title, something like that, because I spend a lot of time these days with my 8-year-old granddaughter. And I have 3 other grandchildren now aged between 3 and 8. So I'm hanging around kids a good bit and I see the kind of things. And I can tell you this from first-hand experience, around 7 or 8 is the stage at which they lose the innocence, at which they begin to become more adults and take on all the things that cause us suffering. So whenever I'm giving a talk, I have 2 things in mind. And the reason I have those 2 things are in mind is because, I know I'm talking with people that a lot of you have, this might be your first time going to any retreat, or your first time coming to TAT, or you may be somebody who understands the teachings and knows them better than I do myself. So the question is, where do I pitch a talk to cover that wide spectrum? And I think back of the days that I went to TAT, and I only went to 2 weekends in TAT, and what I was looking for an understanding of teachings. A lot of things that I heard said in various teachings, I didn't understand what they were getting at, and how could I use them, or how could I apply them? So I have that in mind, that I would hopefully explain some of not just the Richard Rose, our TAT teachings, but other ones that are relevant to our topic today. And at the end of your weekend, I'm hoping to give you some tools to take away with you, because the highlight of your spiritual work is not the weekend when you're doing this. It's what you're doing between this retreat and your next retreat. What you take away with you, what tools you have to use. So at the end, I hope to give you some tools, or actually throughout it, and I'll just maybe make a summary at the end. So I'm reminded of the poem by William Wordsworth, which I'm sure many of you know, Ode to Immortality. And here's what Wordsworth said: "Heaven lies about us in our infancy. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy." So heaven lies about us right now, closer than close. But somehow the prison house has come around us unwittingly. This has happened and is shutting out from us that which is most natural and our essential selves, our core selves. And as Mike said at the start, there are many, you look up, the phrase through the eyes of a child, and there are so many things about it. But Jesus, one of the things he said are in the Gospels, it's written as that Jesus said, you must turn around and become as little children in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. So turn around. When I hear that, I think, isn't that exactly what Richard Rose was talking about when he was talking about his reverse vector? We have to go back. It's not that we're going to someplace new or something we don't know. We have to we're trying to get ourselves back to something that we do know and that we've come from, back to our original state. I looked up the website for Richard Rose teachings, and I came across this. Apparently, he used to say, become as a little child and rid ourselves of bugs and barnacles. I always think that Mr. Rose used such, whimsical language. But he was very accurate with it, because you think of bugs and barnacles. No, I don't quite know what he meant by bugs, but barnacles. I live close to the seaside, and I'm often walking around and I see the rocks and they're covered in barnacles. So when you see barnacles at first, they look like they're part of the rock. They are so camouflaged. You just wouldn't even realize that they were a different thing. And I'll tell you something, if you try to remove a barnacle, it's one of the most difficult things to remove. So somehow along the way in our lives, we have acquired these barnacles that we're not even aware of them, where they're so camouflaged, they're so part of what we think we are. And the business of getting rid of them is pretty difficult. Now, in the normal way, apart from the usual, when you're reading about teachings and so on, you don't hear about barnacles, but you hear about ego and about identities. Same thing. These identities that we've picked up or acquired or developed along the way. And the sum total of them would be called the ego. I think sometimes language can create problems. When we hear the word ego, we have this idea, ego, good or bad. But ego isn't one big solid wall. Ego is a sum total of a collection of beliefs and, expectations and motivations, all kinds of things like that. And they are the barnacles that Mr. Rose talks about. So if we look at a child, the mind of a child and the attitude of a child, and we look at an adult, and what's happened along the way, this shifts has happened in us, and the kind of things that have happened, and I'm just going to give you some examples here, and it's better if you come up with your own, because mine may not be the most accurate. What's happened is we've exchanged naivety for cynicism. The child is naive, and we've become cynical. We don't trust things. We've exchanged trust for suspicion. Optimism has become maybe pessimism. Spontaneity has become habits. Simplicity has been taken over by complexity. Immediacy by abstraction. Acceptance and tolerance have been taken over by judgmentalism. Now, these things happened. These shifts happened in us as we developed different identifications, different identities. Nobody chose any of those. And of course you had to. I mean, you would not survive in the world if you were naive and trusting and simple and accepting of everything. So we had to acquire these other qualities in order to survive. So the ego is the survival mechanism. But as with its acquisition, it blocks out on us our natural selves, our essential selves. Heaven gets blocked along the way. So when I look at those pairs, opposite pairs, You can't really go, say, for instance, from being cynical to be naive. Mr. Rose talked about betweenness. And what I found along the way was if I looked at, say, for instance, I was feeling cynical about something or noticed that I was cynical, then I thought, well, what's the opposite of cynical? And they don't have to be very far away opposites. They can be quite close. And it isn't that you can just you can't just switch back from being cynical to being naive or something like that. But what you can do is you can kind of loosen yourself and you can kind of be in some place between them. You can kind of give a bit of, maybe be less cynical or, even be questioning of your own cynicism. So this is what I think that Mr. Rose meant by betweenness. That when we find ourselves having some personality character or some way that we're thinking or feeling or whatever, if we look for an alternative to it or an opposite to it, and then somehow become a bit looser is all I can say. Just be a bit looser with it rather than being so stuck in. So now if I look for a few minutes at the kind of identifications that a person can acquire along the way. I used to find it very difficult to understand when somebody was talking about saying you're identified with this and you're identified with that. And how was I identified? I just didn't really know what this meant. But we become identified with things like roles. So I'm identified with being a mother, or with being a teacher, or being a good person in my community or something. And when we're identified with it, we get a feeling of power or a feeling of importance or specialness or something like that. So we become kind of a solid something that other people recognize. Of course, any of your identities, they could be positive or negative. We always want the positive ones, the ones that give us, importance or respectability or whatever it is. But you probably could have an identification, say, with being, a drug addict. And that's not something you want to tell people about. But you identify yourself. Basically say to yourself, I'm a drug addict, or whatever the thing is. But it might not be something that you would want to tell others. So I'm saying this because our identifications can be both positive and negative. And the negative ones are usually what's meant by the shadow, the things we don't want people to know about. We have identifications with our body. We want to be, it's good to be slim and to be tall and to be athletic, and maybe the opposite are identifications we don't want. With educational attainment, we live in a society that, if you have high educational attainment, well, that's a good identification, and the opposite is not so good. People often have identifications associated with their lifestyle. Well, I'm somebody who plays a lot of golf, or I go sailing, or, I'm somebody who likes to eat in good restaurants. I'm a foodie, something like that. We're often identified with our emotions. We say things like, I'm upset, I'm angry, I'm a happy person. We can be identified with actions, with the things that we do. I'm a person who, does good stuff for my community. I'm a good community person. Hobbies, I'm a photographer. We have our identifications with our hobbies in the sense of, the football club or the baseball club that we follow, and so on. And of course, with our country and with our family. And all of those things, they just got picked up in what the Buddhists call conditioning. We just, there was no point at which you decided I will be this, or at least not usually you don't decide I will be this or that. It just happened along the way that they got picked up from your community and your family and so on. So when I was going on the spiritual path and I was trying to understand this and the complexity of it, and if I'm identified with this, that, and the other, with every aspect of myself, how do I ever get through it? I mean, how do I get to understand this? And at some point, I realized, actually piecing together with, I don't know how any of you know the Gurdjieff teachings. He was a teacher from the last century in Europe. And he talked about the many I's. I this, like I am this, I am that, I am not, whatever. And this is where this is the same thing as talking about the identifications. So at one point I decided that I would sit down and I would write out a list of all the things that I thought about myself, whether I liked them or not. And I reckon there's about 1,000. Now, you're probably going to start off and say, oh my God, but I'm telling you, and this is something, when I talk about tools, I would encourage you to do this for yourself. 1,000 might sound a lot, but do 10 hundreds and start putting down all the different things about I'm tall, I'm a woman, I'm American, I'm whatever, as many as you can. And you're not going to do it in a day, I can tell you. Give it a week at least, every time you think of another one. And here's the big understanding that is so important, that all of those identifications, they're all false identifications, and they're costing us our true identification. So we'll say 1,000, and I used to refer to them as the roving identifications. None of them are permanent. They keep shifting. You could have been, there was a time when I was single, then there's a time I'm a married person, shifted. You become a parent. So they change, and even any of them that you care to mention. So question anything that you come up with as an identification and say to yourself, well, is it permanent? Because what we're looking for and what's missing is something that's permanent and that's very close and very near, but it's being blocked out. It has never gone away. It's just being blocked out by these roving identifications. And until you're able to see them and name them, they're going to be running the show. They're going to be taking over the space. So this is the purpose of sort of naming down these. You're bringing what's unconscious into consciousness. You've been unconscious of your many roving identifications or barnacles, and getting to see them. So once you see them, now you can begin to do something about it. And that something is not so much to stop them as to move back from them, you become less blinded by them. They become less important. And some of them you can actually drop. You can say it doesn't matter anymore, or you don't give it any energy, or you just, as I say, just move back from it in some way. Okay. I think I've said enough about that. I don't know if, I forgot to ask Mike, am I supposed to leave time at the end for us to ask questions, or for people to ask questions? But I'll just go along with what I'm saying, and if there's time and you want to ask questions, we can do it that way. So the next thing I want to talk about is another teaching of Mr. Rose's, which is called nostalgia. Now, I used to think, and most people, the word is used all the time when we're talking about nostalgia, and people talk about it in terms of, I'm nostalgic for when my grandmother used to make cookies, or, I'm nostalgic for the time when all was well, when life was good, the golden era. Well, I can tell you, there was never a time when the world was, or your life was fine. We just forget about the troubles that existed back then, or it gets whitewashed over. But Mr. Rose used the term very accurately. Nostos means home, and algia it means sickness or longing. So nostalgia is a longing for home. And the home that he's referring to is the kingdom of heaven, the home within you, the place that you came from, your origin. And what he's saying with this teaching is that all of us have within us this longing for where we came from, or when for our origins, when all was well, when we were at peace. I mean, the peace that passeth understanding. This is what we're talking about. Or as Jesus referred to it as the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is within. Home, the home within, the home that we have never left. So, thinking of nostalgia in this way, it's something that we're going back to, and we all remember it or know it, even if we don't know it consciously. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. And my reason for telling you those stories, that I'm hoping to trigger a memory in you, or it may get triggered very early, or if not, that after this talk or whenever, you might, having articulated it, something may come up for you. And the reason for this is that you would consciously have an experience of what nostalgia, or what the peace that passeth understanding. You would have your own experience to go on. And it gives you the direction in which this spiritual work is going. Now, fairly recently, I read a biography of a woman who became a nun. And she was talking about, she was a teenager at the time, and she was one afternoon or one evening walking home after a walk with her father, and she's heading towards home. And as they're coming down home, something happened in which I think sort of almost like the world stopped, and she felt this sense of presence, this presence that was behind everything. A presence behind everything. And she realized that it was such a striking experience for her that she ended up entering a convent in search of this, because she thought, she figured out, or for her, this was the secret of the world, this presence behind everything that's blocked out. Now, when I first started coming to TAT, and I was hearing about somebody else describing nostalgia, and that we all have a memory of it from our childhood, we couldn't not. I remembered an incident from my own life when I think I was about 6 or 7, I don't really know. My father was a farmer. So my brother and I were in the field with my father. And it started to make a shower, which would be fairly typical where I live. And we went to the side of the field where there was a hazel bush, and we sat under it. And I sat on my father's right-hand side and my brother on his left, and he put his jacket around us to save us from the shower. And I remember that, and it's probably only about 5 minutes, as just the complete peace. Peace is what I would have said about it. This peace that was everywhere, a total peacefulness. So when I heard somebody talking in TAT about nostalgia and this memory that we all have of a time when that we know this peace within us, I thought, that's it. I recognize that, but I had never thought it was important. I mean, I wouldn't even have bothered mentioning it. What would you say about it? I had 5 minutes of peace when I was 7 or something like that. But I also realized that, why, of all the 5 minutes in your life in 7 or 8 years, that a particular 5 would remain as a memory. There has to be something about it that's significant. So I brought this conversation up a couple of weeks ago with a couple of friends who were visiting. And I was asking them, I was trying to describe nostalgia and what this teaching was and the significance of it. And both of them very quickly were able to tell me of incidents that they related to or associated with what I was talking about. And one of them said that she had been one evening, or I think in the garden of her house with her father, and that somehow this sense of peace, again, came. And I asked her to describe it, and she said that nothing was lacking. It was a few moments, and when there was that complete sense of everything was present, nothing was lacking. And I don't know what age that woman was. I mean, was she? I think she was younger, teenager or younger. And the other woman who was there, who was an adult at the time, talked about a time that she was sitting at the beach on her own and it was dark. And she remembered, again, a sort of a 5 minutes of total peacefulness or something special about it anyway. And I asked her how would she describe it, and she said, well, you couldn't say anything about it. It didn't have any qualities that you would say anything about it. Now, you might be tempted to think with this that what happened was it was a few moments in which somebody had the world had all its ducks in a row and everything was fine and everything was organized. But actually what's happened is the ego has disappeared. So this peacefulness that we know, it's what's there in the background when ego, any aspect of ego, is no longer running the show or taking up the space or dominating our consciousness or to whatever extent. So what we're trying to do is to get back to a place where that peacefulness, where ego isn't all the time on show. And the thing is, one could have many of those experiences. Actually, as my spiritual path went on, there were more and more of those experiences. And I realized that what was happening, or my interpretation nowadays of what was happening, was ego was thinning out and there were getting to be spaces. This is why, of course, people go and spend, time in solitary retreat, or the various practices that we are doing are hoping to make us loosen up or weaken some of these very strong identifications that we have. And so we begin to get a breakthrough. It's not that something new has happened or something new has come in. What's happened is the false identities or the false selves, or gaps are coming in. The veil is thinning. Okay. So I'm just going to talk about something else here just for a couple of minutes, which is the idea of conscience. I hope I'm not going too fast, shifting from one idea to another for people. And this is a phrase, and I think it might have been Bob Ferguson. I don't know if Bob is here or not. And by the way, Bob Ferguson has written a number of, done some very good teachings on the idea of nostalgia. And in the TAT forum for April 2017, there's an article on nostalgia by Bob Ferguson, which will tell you more or explain more than I've done here. And also he has a short YouTube video about it. Now, and I don't know if it was Bob that said this or where it came from, but what it was said that the connection between us and our inner child is our conscience. So your conscience is your connection to your inner child. Now, if you lose connection to your inner child, then you lose your conscience, we'll say. And some religions, in particular the one I grew up in, would have an awful lot to say about conscience and living with your conscience and having a well sharpened conscience. And I would say about myself that your conscience is a guide. It's the guide that will keep you within, I don't want to say but within the straight and narrow, but it's the phrase that comes to mind at the moment. It will keep you on track, give you an opening. It'll keep you with an opening back to your original nature. So that's a significant thing for everyone to, to protect your own conscience. It's your connection with your inner child. So now I'm going to go on to another topic, which is the topic of the inner child. Now, nowadays, or actually, the therapy or the usually comes, if you come across the idea of the inner child, it's mostly going to come up in terms of therapy or psychology, or the abandoned inner child or something like that. But it's of relevance to us here, since the inner child is what we're talking about and how to get back to it, and the significance from it from a spiritual development point of view. I don't remember at what stage in my life I came across work on the inner child, but long before I came across TAT anyway. I was trying to heal myself, and of course, which is why everybody gets into this. And the book I came across was by somebody called Charles Winfield. I think he may have been the first one, but since then, a lot of people, a lot of people have developed this idea and have worked on it. So if you Google inner child, you'll come across all kinds of things. So I Googled it recently when I was looking at this, and I came across, I think the guy, the name that I came across is Matteo Sol, Mateo Sol. I don't know whether they're quoting him on this website or was it his website. But anyway, the ideas you come will generally, the gist of them will be the same. And it says, inner child work is the process of contacting, understanding, embracing, and healing your inner child. The inner child represents your original self. It contains your capacity for wonder, joy, innocence, sensitivity, and playfulness. And I notice I've written a note beside it, and I'm saying here, your inner child is what you are before you become fragmented, because the inner child is whole. It's not fragmented off into these different, what I've been calling, identifications. So how do you go about doing this? And there's no point in just understanding this. With any of the stuff you're doing on the spiritual path, you have to do it. That's the thing. I know lots of people who just understand all the teachings and can compare teachers and teachings, but they don't actually do the things. So doing the stuff with the inner child, which it might sound a bit silly, some of the stuff, but actually it works. And I can tell you that from experience. So he gives 5 points for how to reconnect with your inner child to do this work. So the first one, I'm just going to read them out to you. So to reconnect with your inner child, make a list of the things that you enjoyed as a child. Spend time daydreaming and going back in memory. Get out a packet of crayons. I know that it might seem silly to do the kind of things. Actually, it's wonderful to have grandchildren because you get to do all those things, just doing them along with them, and it brings it back to you. I think a lot of people avoid stuff about the inner child because they had more maybe painful or had things that happened in childhood that they want to forget about. But also, you may certainly have some issues like that because nobody gets through childhood scot-free, that I'm sure of. But in there also, there are times of peace and contentment and just not doing anything. I find that with myself, that one of the things that had happened to me as an adult, I became very directed. Everything I did had to be sensible or achieve something or acquire something. You were doing something. It wouldn't be just wasting time. That wouldn't have been a good idea, to be just doing something for no reason other than the fact that you just feel like doing it, be it, swinging your feet in a puddle or any kind of things. So I would say deliberately just do things that have served no purpose other than just your pleasure and enjoyment, just to reawaken that aspect of yourself. Here's one. He says, identify your specific inner child. Is it an abandoned child? Is it a playful child? Is it a fearful child? It's good if you still have parents alive to ask them, what kind of a child were you? Your parents, probably your mother, anybody will be able to tell you, even if you know any neighbor or whatever, well, what was I like as a child? And see if that brings up anything for you. Were you a loner kind of a child? Did you want to be on your own? Were you somebody who just had to have company all the time? Were you demanding? What was it? But I think it's interesting that he says that find the kind of child that you are. Write a letter to your child. Write a letter to yourself as you were. Say, imagine yourself as you were 5 years old. It's useful if you have a photograph, I think, maybe, that you can look at it. Even if you don't remember it, you can see, maybe it'll give you some clues about yourself, even the kind of clothes that you had or kind of things that you did. Pay attention to your feelings. I mean, children, they feel much more than they think. Their feelings is what they operate on all the time. So actually start paying attention to your own feelings. So I'm going to divert here another little bit and bring up something. I don't know if you've ever noticed, say for instance, you're walking along on a beautiful beach and everything is fine and everything should be fine. You've no problems in the world, but you just feel miserable. You're anxious or you're worried or you're something like that. So your outer life and your inner life don't match. Now, it went a long time in my life not really noticing that, or not really noticing the significance of it. But in the Christian tradition, and I don't know, in other ones as well, maybe they talk a lot about the soul. And my soul, this and my soul, as if my soul is different from whatever it is. But I have come to think that your soul is the inner. It's, you could be in a perfect place, but your soul is unhappy because there is something about it that's not being satisfied. So what I'm saying here is, when you're a child, really, I think your soul and your outer self, they're the one thing. They're not, you haven't yet separated them. You're aware of your feelings, you know what they are. You're straight out in a rage if you didn't get what you wanted, and you don't hold back with your emotions or something, or suppress them. So I think it's a very useful thing to notice that how you feel is not a measure of your external circumstances. And how you feel inside. A lot of times people learn along the way to avoid their feelings or to suppress them. But actually you're suppressing your inner life. You're shutting it down. You're not allowing it to come out. You don't know what's going on in your soul. So I think, paying attention to your feelings and looking inside and seeing to yourself, well, what am I feeling right now? And what is that? And how come I'm feeling gloriously happy today, although there's nothing great happening? I don't know if you've ever noticed this happen for no good reason. Sometimes you're just gloriously happy for no reason. You think, how did that happen? And things where nothing has changed majorly from yesterday. I remember my husband at one stage saying to me that he couldn't understand why sometimes he was just extremely happy, full of joy, although, as he said himself, the world hadn't changed or nothing had changed. And having this conversation with him about your inner life and your outer life and the disconnect between them. And I think that's part of what happens to us as a child, that disconnect happens. And we can reconnect back by looking to see what is it. Now, in terms of religions, they talk about, the soul wants something. If the soul is unhappy, what is it? So it gives you an opportunity to start looking and seeing what's causing. Well, maybe it's not even cause. Again, it's a kind of like a guide, like your conscience. You may notice that in particular circumstances, that the soul is much happier. Out in nature, it'd be one for a lot of people, or when you're on your own as opposed to in company. And in that way, you get to know something, you get to know what your inner life wants. You get to know it for yourself in your specifics. And one of the last thing that he says here is to be mindful of the inner critic. When you find yourself sabotaging yourself and criticizing yourself or whatever, you weren't born with that. That's not the inner child. That came from someplace. When I was talking about the identities, one of the things is see if you can find anything there that you didn't hear from someplace else. All identifications have been given to you. You've been told them one way or another, or you picked them up someplace. They haven't come from within you. When I remember at one stage when I was trying to find my true self, I was going through all kinds of things to see, could I find something about myself that nobody had told me? Could I find one quality about myself that I had not been told by the world, or that I had not picked up one place or another? Was like, okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience with the inner child. I don't know if this is relevant or would be relevant to other people, but the reason for telling it even would be in the hopes that it might be. When I used to meditate or something like that, I would be sitting, I would be like, all the activity happened out front. I was looking to see thoughts arising, observing my thoughts and doing this. And I was thinking of them as if I was a tunnel and looking out, I'm talking now with my eyes closed, or if there was any change, say, brighter or darker or light, or if any inner images came up, anything like that. And I was doing this work on the inner child, and I was trying to find it, and I couldn't. There was nothing coming up at all about the inner child. I couldn't see anything. So one day I had the idea that actually just looking out in front was like a blinkered vision. And now I'm talking within meditation. So I decided that I would start looking out to the side. This is with my eyes closed now. Was there anything, if I looked out a bit this way, or if I looked out about this, and so I was doing this, and it looked, all I can say is around here, the best I can describe it. You know what a fog looks like? So it's like as if I was a sphere that was a fog, and things arose in this fog. Maybe it was a bit clearer in front of the eyes or something like that. And so I'm looking around, scanning, thinking there must be, this inner child must be someplace. And I remember looking to this side, and it was just a grey fog, and I was trying to see, was there any bits of it that were brighter or darker? Was there any kind of move in it at all? I don't know if this happened the first time I did it, but after a couple of times, I noticed a darker area. So what is that? Like in the fog, something that's a bit darker. So I put when I say I turned my, I turned my attention. It wasn't my eyes, it was my attention to look at that. And it moved. And I went, yeah, what is that? And I got a bit of a fright. And actually, fairly quickly, I realized it was a child. And then I realized it was me. It was me as a child. And this was a very fearful. It had its back to me, looking into the wall or into whatever, and it was shy of me. And me was a bit upset about it and so on. And I realized that I had actually come upon the inner child, and I had seen that written in some of the websites and some of the things, identify or locate your inner child. And I had expected to come upon ideas or memories or something. I hadn't expected to come upon something that was like an energy, a ball of energy and it was like grey. And then it came out, and I brought it out. And this is over a period of time. It didn't all happen in one day or anything like that. And so I started doing the things that I had read about, talk to the inner child and say, look I will self-parent you. I abandoned you as a child. We all think our parents abandoned us and so on, but we abandoned ourselves. in favor of, you know, the power and the control or whatever, you know, the influence we got with our various identifications. So in this way, this child I brought back and started talking to her. And of course, I mean, I knew her. I mean, this is me as a child. So I knew who it was. And I knew the neurosis and the shyness and all of that. And I started doing things like saying, well, what would you like to do? And then out of the blue would come, well, I'd like an ice cream. Okay, we'll go and get ice cream. And here, you know, adult Tess wouldn't be eating ice cream because she didn't want to get fat. So little girl Tess wanted, you know, like, just want an ice cream. We'll do that. And I started doing various other things. I ended up actually buying myself a doll. And that doll was in my bed for 10 years. I don't know what happened to it in the end. And it was because this child had felt, well, she didn't get a doll. Now, that may not be relevant to anybody other than myself. And it may be just the thing that would give you the clue or the way of finding your way back to yourself. Okay. I have one other piece of a topic or an idea that I want to talk about. Mike, I don't know who's organizing this or who's in charge. If I'm going on too long and you need me to stop, just butt in, whoever it is. So the one last thing I wanted to talk about in relation to this comes from the Zen tradition. And they talk about Zen mind, beginner's mind. So beginner's mind is really what we're talking about here, the mind of a child or through the eyes of a child. And this year actually is the 50th anniversary. Can you see that? Is it backwards? This book was published in the States 50 years ago by Shunryu Suzuki. So it's considered to be a spiritual classic. And in it, he's talking about beginner's mind. So I'm going to give you a couple of quotations from it, just to give you a flavor of the kind of things. The very first sentence in the book says, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. So us adults, I guess he's using the word expert there to mean us adults. We have shut down so many of the possibilities by knowing this or by knowing that. Another one that he says here is, doing something is expressing our own nature. Well, that's exactly what children do. They're just doing whatever they're doing. We do not exist for the sake of something else. We exist for the sake of ourselves. Because so often as an adult, you know, I exist for the sake of raising my family or teaching in school or contributing to society or contributing to the community in some way. Maybe we've never known. Nobody has ever said to us, you exist for your own sake. Your life is for you. It's not just as a functionary in the world or in society. I mean, that's what society or conditioning tells us, you know, how useful we are to the world or society that we live in. But how about your life for yourself? So in beginner's mind is also talking about things like being closed-minded. We could ask ourselves, in what way are our minds closed? I mean, you're not going to be able to come up with this immediately in something, but as you're going along, you know, you might find yourself thinking, well, I'm very close to this possibility or to that, or I wouldn't even hear tell of it. And again, getting back to the whole business of Richard Rose and betweenness, you know, it isn't that you go from believing one thing to believing its opposite, or from thinking one thing to thinking its opposite. It's a question more of loosening your attachment, or you're being locked into a particular thing, getting a bit freer of it, a bit more detached, or giving yourself just opening up a little bit of possibilities. I find that oftentimes people think that if they have liberal values that they're open-minded. Well, they're not. I mean, liberal values, they're just another set of values. It's one of the things. And talking about open-minded and closed-minded, I mean, I think it was Jesus also said, he that has ears, let him hear. What are you not hearing? What are you closed against hearing? What are you set and adamant against? If you can find those things in yourself, these are the ways in which you begin to free yourself from the prison that has closed around you. And I'm going to say just one other thing before I do a summary. And that is, you know, a lot of times we get, people become lost or don't distinguish between opinion and fact. We think that whatever is our opinion is a fact. And I just suggest to you that at, you know, anything actually that you hear from other people or from yourself, you might say to yourself, well, is that an opinion or is that a fact? What evidence do I have to support that? You know, there's a lot less facts than there are opinions around. And yeah, so I'll just say that. So I'm just going to quickly, well, I won't do it, Giselle. I'm just going to say, does anybody want to ask me any questions or bring anything up at this point? I've gone racing through an awful lot of stuff there, so I wouldn't be surprised.
Tess, it's Mike. We do have some questions. People have been posting questions to the chat room. So if it's good for you now, we'll go back and we'll go over some of those questions.
Okay, that's grand, Mike.
Okay, going back a bit, there are a couple of questions that have to do with the idea of conscience, having a conscience or being a conscience. And one of the questions is, how do you define what that conscience is? Is it from the point of view of a moral goodness, or is it from the point of view of blameworthiness of one's own conduct? So is conscience a guide, or is conscience the critic telling you, no, don't do that?
I think of conscience as to do with your feelings. And I don't know exactly how, because so I think of conscience as a very personal thing. So for what's okay for one person to do is not okay for another person. And I don't, I know that like it gets talked about in, you know, moral values and so on, but I think that we have within us
moral compass,
some kind of a thing that if, you know, if we, like a child, if they hurt an animal, and this isn't true for all children actually, this is why I think that conscience is such a specific thing. I'm sure it's influenced by culture and by ethics or whatever. And I've been asked this question actually in TAT before. You know, I don't know, can I define it exactly, or, you know, is it a set of beliefs or something? But I don't think it is. I think it's exactly what it says. It's our connection to our inner child. And when our sensitivity, our vulnerability, whatever those various qualities of a child, and I don't think they stand up to, I don't think it stands up to scrutiny, to external scrutiny. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
In other words, it's personal to the person.
Okay, we've got
people aren't agreeing with me. Well, does everybody feel they have a conscience? Does somebody feel that you don't have a conscience? So what is it? It's not just the same as right and wrong. It's something a bit different, I think. What's right for you and maybe not right for you.
It feels, Tess, it feels to me like an inner compass. It's a kind of instinctive response to things, and it does feel personal. And it never lets me down. It might be telling me something I don't want to hear, but it's there always, for me.
Yeah, I don't know who that is, but that's exactly what I would say about it too. An inner compass that is personal to me. And if you go outside of it, it causes a lot of suffering and pain. And it's not necessarily, the same things wouldn't necessarily apply to somebody else. So that's why I think that it is to do with the inner child. I don't know. I mean, I wonder if Bob Ferguson is here, and if Bob wrote that statement. Don't know.
I'm not sure, Tess. I've heard things like that before. I think that it basically, the conscience is a voice that says, "Hey, buddy, you're going the wrong way. Keep track of what you really want to do." And eventually, that can go from being your conscience to being your consciousness once you get familiar with it.
Actually, that's very good, Bob. That's exactly what happens with it. It develops into something, but it was certainly, I always felt it was a guidance, an inner guidance that kept me on track. And there would have been terrible suffering if I broke it, if I went, and how do I know that? I know that because I did break my conscience, went outside of it and realized that, it causes more pain than it's worth. So there was a sensitivity that remained alive, and you're right, it goes from conscience to consciousness. Yes. Anybody else comment on that?
Hey, Tess, there's a question here about whether or not following that inner child could lead you to do things that you would regret in the adult world.
Like what?
I don't know. Let's see who posed the question.
I mean, the thing is, you don't, following the inner child, we're talking about recovering our inner child from having abandoned it. We're not talking about becoming childish and foolish and nonsensical. You don't go back to that. But in the process of becoming an adult, we have lost contact with what we're calling our inner child, our essential selves. It's a way of, saying inner child is a way of naming or articulating for ourselves our essential selves. Because if you talk about your essential self, people say, what do you mean by that? Or give me some clues or some hints. So it isn't like you become silly or foolish or become childish. There's a difference between being childish and childlike.
Okay, we've got questions here about the disconnect or apparent disconnect between your inner child and your who you see yourself as now, and I guess the questions refer to whether or not there actually is, it's something you've lost and there's now a separation, or is in fact that not the case? There is no separation.
Well, with awakening, there's no separation. It becomes, they get reunited. There aren't two. But prior to awakening, it seems to me that the identities are running the show.
Okay, so there would be, there's another question here that ties into the same thing. Is there a difference between the inner child and, the inner child and what you really are? So I guess you've answered that in a fashion.
No, it's, this journey that we go on, arriving whole in the world, and, our true selves, our true nature are shining, but we couldn't survive if we stayed like that. So we learn survival strategies to live in the world, and those survival strategies block out our true nature to varying or lessening degrees. I think with some people never totally lose connection with their inner child, and I think other people lose it much more. And then the spiritual path is about going backwards, really, losing the things. We don't lose them. They stop they stop being dominant. We get spaces between them, or they thin out. The identifications thin out, so that the true nature can begin to shine through again. And they're not two separate things. How could they be? I mean, there's only one. There's only the one. Like, we become reintegrated back to our original selves, while we hold on to. We don't lose our survival mechanisms. They're still functioning.
Okay, we've got a couple questions here that look at the issue of conscience and intuition. Is the conscience and the intuition the same thing?
I don't know, but I would tell you that the two of them were very strong things, very strong in me. I mean, I always had what would be considered intuitive, and I've also talked about having this conscience. Now, I did grow up in a culture where there'd be a lot of talk about conscience and knowing your conscience and so on, so I would have had that word for it. I'd be interested to hear if other people think that they're the same thing. I'm not able to distinguish between them.
We've got another question here. The question is, I'll read it. Say you feel called to action in the day-to-day by your conscience, your inner child. How do you maintain betweenness then without embodying a polarized set of values? Are you pulled between the two?
Read it again, because I don't really understand what's being asked there.
Okay. Say you feel called to action in the day-to-day by your conscience, your inner child. And then the next question, how do you maintain betweenness then without embodying a polarized set of values? Sounds like they say, can you end up split between the two?
I don't know. I mean, called to action by your conscience. I mean, I would have found that my conscience was more a prohibitor than anything. Don't do that. That's not a good idea. I've wondered if it wasn't related to the, what did Richard Rose called it? The something observer. The, what was the word that Richard Rose had? The phrase for, you know, some kind of observer. You know, what's observing?
Process observer.
Say it again.
Process observer.
The process observer. I mean, I'm wondering, I thought when I was writing about that, I was thinking, is the conscience, is that the same thing as a conscience, a process observer, that you are observing what's going on with? Well, although a process observer, I think, is, no, it's not. They're not the same. They're definitely not the same thing. I'm not being very useful here, am I, to somebody, because I don't really understand how there could be a conflict between, well, the conscience, you don't get called to, I didn't ever feel that I was called to do particular things with it. It was, you know, it was more to not do something, that wouldn't be a good idea, and it would be to do, maybe to not hurt somebody, or don't do that because it would hurt that person. Yeah.
Tess, I'm thinking of it. Sorry. Go on, Ailish. Go on. I'm thinking of a time when I didn't listen to my conscience, when I observed this adult hitting a child on a boat I was on, a ferry. Yeah. I didn't intervene, and it stayed with me for a long time. And I knew that's what I needed to do. But I wasn't relying on my intuition. There was something much stronger than that was guiding me. And it was only my own fears of getting hurt myself that stopped me from going and protecting the child.
Yeah, I had a situation exactly like that, actually, Ailish, in which I saw a child being hurt by somebody. And I did want to do something about it. But when I assessed the situation, I realized I would only cause more problem for me and for that child and for that family. Now, it wasn't an ongoing thing, it was an incident. And I do think that that's a version of conscience. If I could have done something about it, I would have. But you'd have to make an assessment as well as to whether or not that's possible in the circumstances, or whether, so making an assessment of,
Just to say that what follows on from that is that wouldn't happen to me today, because some of those barnacles and identifications you referred to have thinned out and gone away, and I probably wouldn't hesitate.
The situation I'm talking about, I still would hesitate, because if I did anything, it would have caused more problem for the child involved and for myself because of the adult that did it. So, I mean, so there are things that you can't do anything about. So I guess, I mean, a conscience isn't about cleaning up the world and, you know, managing the world or anything like that. It's about your own behavior. It's about an assessment of your own behavior and what triggers you. I mean, there's an element of sensitivity to it, which I think is, you know, the inner child is sensitive to hurt and to, you know, vulnerability, or recognizes, well, maybe doesn't always recognize other people's vulnerabilities, but that kind of thing. Well, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I mean, that's, I know it's just a golden rule, but it's, I think it's related to conscience and not intuition. So that's why I think intuition and conscience might be different.
I've got a question about growing up. Parent, you being a parent, a grandmother, and living your own life. If we start out as a child and somehow we end up as an adult, then what is growing up about then? What should it be? What is it? What could it be? The process of growing up.
Becoming able to survive in the world. I mean, that's all I think it. That's all I think it is, anyway. That you know, I mean, becoming able to survive.
I remember in your book, This Above All, you talked about a point in your life where you were changing, and as you described it, you were looking for a way to become, I think your phrase was, an authentic person, or to be authentic.
Yeah,
so
person
there
of
was
integrity.
some prompting there, was prompting you to live your life differently.
Yeah, I'd say conscience. That was my idea of, you know, a person of integrity. A person of integrity would have been somebody who would, conscience would play part in that. There was a whole, I mean, I think it was, you know, everybody has a whole set of ideas and so on with what's prompting them forward in their lives. And from when I was quite young, I had ideas about becoming the most that I could in this life. And that wasn't to do with becoming famous or wealthy or anything like that, but I had ideas of becoming a person of character. I mean, I was definitely thinking of becoming a person. I didn't have any ideas of not being a person at that stage. But the prompting was that one could become, you could be in a state of arrested development and just be 20 and stay like that forevermore, or you could become, I don't know, becoming is the word, something. So, I mean, I was always trying different things towards that becoming. And I just called it becoming a person of integrity, because that was the language that I had.
Okay.
And I recognized it actually in people. I recognized, you know, from even when I was a teenager, I had met people, and I recognized that some people were what I called a person of integrity and some were not. And I could see that it was separate from personality. I mean, some of the people, the least integrity had, you know, very charming and glorious personalities. And some of the odd bods that were awkward were really a person of integrity. I'd seen a few examples of it, enough for me to know that that there was something that you could become, that there were possibilities. Funnily enough, about 5 years ago, I met a young Russian woman, and she could barely speak English. And when she was leaving, she said to me, you know, when I grow up or when I get older, I want to grow like you. I want to become like you. She said, I didn't know that people could become like you. She knows nothing about my spiritual life or anything. And at the time I thought, you know, what she saw was what I used to call a person of integrity. That there was something that you can become something rather than, you know, whimsical or fragmented or whatever words you'd use, some kind of wholesomeness. I don't know what it was. So I had come across that a few times, and I think probably everybody does. And you wouldn't necessarily be thinking of it as somebody enlightened or something like that. You would be like, that's a person that's, you know, I want to grow that way. I want to become that kind of way. Now, I didn't have the language of enlightenment or anything like that about it, and I didn't know what it was, but I just knew that I wanted to become that way or go in that direction.
Tess, we've got another question here, a little different. Rob writes, in your book, Tess, you give clear advice on forms of prayer. Can we use prayer to help us return home to rediscover the inner child?
Yeah. Prayer is, as taught in the Christian or the Catholic, you know, way of doing things. The idea with it is always that we are not alone, that there is, and this is just a way of talking about things, you know, everything, all teachings are a mythology. They're a way of talking about something that's, because it's universal, there are ways have been invented. So in the Christian line of thinking, they say there's a God, something, who created us. And I'm not talking now about a God up in the sky or anything like that, but there is something that created us, or out of which we have arisen. And that, we'll call it God, that cares for its creations. It cares for what it created. And it is always, it wants us back. It wants us home. So the idea of prayer, and they often do this, when you sit down to pray, you have two chairs, one for you and one for God, so that you are not alone when you are there. That we are never alone. Now, maybe what the Buddhists call capital S self is there. Small self, capital S self has never left, has never gone away, but we've forgotten about it. So a deliberate attempt for us to sit with capital S self or with God and say, I'm here, wanting reconnection, and I'll sit and wait. Can you help me? So, Rob, so basically sitting in with an attitude of waiting patiently, and then maybe something will come up for you, maybe some ideas, maybe a thought will pass by, maybe just a calmness will arise, but it will take the form of inner feeling, inner subtle feeling. That it won't always, sometimes you won't always be able to be there, but so that's a practice, as opposed to, say, meditation where you're actually looking at thoughts or seeing what arises, where you're deliberately looking for something that's arising within yourself. With prayer, you're inviting what created you to make contact with you or to become present to you. And oftentimes people recognize it as a sense of presence. I'm not alone. There is a presence. Like, remember I told you the story earlier about the woman who became a nun. She felt this presence. There is a presence that is here all the time, that's everywhere. and for us to make connection with it. And it's experiential. I mean, the thing is, you have to sit and do it. There's no point in talking about it. And it sounds like maybe you're not doing anything much, but actually, even 5 minutes of quality time spent just sitting, showing up, visiting.
Yes, we have just a few minutes left, so there's an opportunity if you would have any closing thoughts or summing up or last takeaways that we could do that now before we wrap up.
Yeah, okay. So I'm just going to just go back over, do a summary of what I said. Things that you might do. So I talked about nostalgia and how it is basically a guide back within ourselves, and that if you can recall a memory of a time when you experienced the peace that passeth understanding or total peace or something, that's where nostalgia is pointing you inside, not outside. I suggested that you make out a list of all your various kinds of identifications. See, can you find anything there that anything original, or did you just pick them all up from the world or from around you, which you did?
Tess?
Try to make contact with your inner child. Give a list of a couple of things to do there. I suggested it's the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which I think Beginner's Mind is helpful. And then I suggested as well that, Bob Ferguson's article on nostalgia in the forum and his YouTube. So there's plenty of things there for somebody to be continuing with and to be working with, and really just keep doing it, I heard somebody say recently about something that so often people give up. They get fed up doing something just when they're on the cusp of success. I hope that wouldn't happen to you with your spiritual path, because I really think with your spiritual path, once you get on it, it will never let go of you until it finds its resolution. Until if your inner child, that inner child is trying to make contact with you, it will, it will keep at you until the reconnection is made. So yeah, that's it from me, I think.